You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Finding Genius podcast. I have Kay ODonnell. She's a vice president of the WALTHAM Pet Care Science Institute. We're going to be talking about her work with animals and microbiomes and all that interesting stuff. So, Kay, thanks for coming.
You're very welcome. Very, very good to be here.
Yeah. So, I've spoken to a lot of people about the microbiome, but not in regards to pets. And it's funny, when I look at my dogs, I do think of them as the holobionts, and I realize they do have microbiomes and all that stuff, but I really don't know much about them. So tell me about your work. What got you interested in this stuff in the first place?
The WALTHAM Pet Care Science Institute as remit is to understand what drives health and well-being in pets, cats, dogs, fish, horses. And the microbiome is one area that is a focus for us because our understanding of microbiomes that exist in all species, and they can exist in the gastrointestinal tract, in the mouth, on the skin, in the hair. As we learn more, our understanding is that they have an influence on health. And part of our remit is to understand what is that influence and how do they influence health and how can we modulate the microbiome to improve health and well-being of cats, dogs, fish, and horses. And so it's a very complex area because it's affected by very many different factors. And it's one of the areas that we focus on along with biomarkers, human-animal interaction, all with the aim of understanding what drives pet health and well-being. So the microbiome is in fact a biomarker. Biomarker is something that is an indicator of the health status of a pet, in our case. And we do a lot of work on trying to understand what biomarkers are relevant to monitor health, what biomarkers are relevant that indicate negative changes in health, and what biomarkers are relevant to indicate positive changes in health. And to give you a little bit of an example around some of the biomarker work that we've done more generally, we've been looking more closely at biomarkers that we have access to through the vast amount of data we have from our veterinary business. And these are blood and urine and fecal biomarkers, and understanding how they link to different health statuses. And one of the exciting developments that we've launched very recently is a biomarker which helps us identify cats at high risk of chronic kidney disease, for example. Chronic kidney disease is the number one killer of cats over 5 years old. It's usually a progressive disease. We don't fully understand the cause, and it's typically diagnosed when 40 to 70% of kidney function is already lost. So it's very difficult to diagnose. And we have developed a diagnostic test, a predictive diagnostic test, which identifies cats at high risk of developing chronic kidney disease 2 years earlier than when it would be typically diagnosed by a vet. Typically, it's diagnosed at blood and urine parameters. And this essentially is kind of developing our understanding of biomarkers through the use of data and clinical data and medical data. And essentially what we did is we we looked at the medical records of about 150,000 cats and 750,000 Banfield pet hospital patient visits over 20 years. And we looked at how different biomarkers in blood and urine changed over time in cats that went on to develop chronic kidney disease and cats that didn't go on to develop chronic kidney disease. And actually what you see is very, very subtle changes in a range of different biomarkers, but incredibly difficult for us as humans, if you like, to understand which of those changes are relevant over time. And so we used artificial intelligence and computing, equivalent to about 600,000 computing hours, to develop an algorithm. So it's one of these AI algorithms that we run on data that we collect routinely in our pet hospitals, and that allows us to identify cats at high risk of disease development up to 2 years earlier than would normally be diagnosed by a vet. So that's very exciting, and I think it kind of indicates, if you like, a change in the way we're approaching health of pets in a much more proactive way. How can we assess health status? How can we intervene early? And how can we maintain good health status? In this case, it's through an algorithm that identifies cats at high risk of developing chronic kidney disease. But in the future, it could well be, how do we identify biomarkers within the microbiome that help us identify cats or dogs at risk of disease development, or cats and dogs that are developing normally versus cats and dogs that are developing less normally. And so biomarkers is a very big area, and microbiome is a significant area within the biomarker research program that we have. So it's very exciting. It allows us to be much more proactive in terms of addressing health issues of our pets. And, we see it as a mirror of what's happening in human health as well, where we're using AI and we're using biomarkers as indications of health status so that we can intervene early. So what do you do, for example, if you know your cat is at high risk of developing chronic kidney disease early? There are lots of things you might do. You might look for specific comorbidities that we know exist with chronic kidney disease. Could be around oral health. Cats with chronic kidney disease often have poor oral health, so you pay more attention to good oral health. You would ensure that your cat is well hydrated. You might look to ensure that your cat had a good high quality diet where you manage phosphorus intake. You would ensure that your cat maintained a healthy weight, and you would be checking on the litter habits of your cat to make sure that you spotted any differences early. And again, you had the opportunity to intervene early. And so the whole idea of the work that we do at WALTHAM is, how do we understand biomarkers and the microbiome within that to understand health status of cats and when that health status changes? Because our aim is to identify very early changes in health status. So at that point, you can intervene early and change outcomes and improve health span and quality of life of our pet.
Okay, so from what I understand, when people have pets, it's hard enough to get people to pay attention to their own health and do things when they're not feeling well or when things aren't going wrong. We can't really talk to our pets. We can observe them, and I'm sure we do. But how do you catch things early, let's say in a cat or a dog, especially a cat, which, they seem to be pretty aloof. So of course, all the basics, look at their litter, et cetera. But what are some things now you've learned that you can tell people to look for in their pets that'll show them early on something's going wrong?
We would suggest that people watch the behavior of their pets, and usually pet owners are pretty good at spotting changes in behavior of their pet, be those litter habits, be those the amount that their pet sleeps, how much they interact with either other pets or other people within the household. So we would suggest that is one thing they should do. I think another thing that is increasingly common is routine health checks for pets. As you rightly said, pets can't tell us if they're not feeling so good. And sometimes it isn't immediately obvious by observation that something is wrong. So routine health checks for pets, which would probably involve, urine and blood tests, would be good indications of when things start to move out of kilter a little bit, and we start to see some shifts in health status. So those would be the first things that I would suggest.
So what have you compared, I don't know if there are any, but cats that aren't domesticated or don't live in a home, or dogs with ones that do, to see if their microbiomes, for instance, are different?
There has been studies that look at cats in different environments, and we do know the microbiome is impacted by the environment, which makes it a little bit more complex to understand what bits of the microbiome are affected by the health of the cat and what bits are affected by the environment in which it exists. So I think, yes, we would expect to see changes in cats operating in different environments. In terms of between wild state cats and domestic cats that live in households, we would expect to see some changes. I think it's also fair to say we don't fully understand the significance of those differences at those points. We know they're different, but we're still at the stage of trying to pull apart, if you like, the data to understand what differences mean that a cat is healthier or what differences mean the cat is less healthy. We understand some very broad differences between profiles of microbes that are present in the microbiome, but we don't fully understand it. And so there's a lot of work still to do in the microbiome.
In terms of biomarkers, what are you looking at? What are the ones that you predominantly use? Are they from blood? Are they from urine? Like, what's the easiest way? Saliva?
I would say that the number of areas that we look at in biomarkers, blood and urine are ones that we look at for more general health because they're routinely collected when cats go for health checks at vets. And so we have a lot of data in that area, and they contain a lot of very useful data in terms of understanding the health status of a cat. Other biomarkers that we look at may be in saliva, maybe swabs that we take from the oral cavity to help us understand oral health. Historically, we've done a lot of work on dog oral health and understanding what the oral microbiome looks like in healthy dogs and less healthy dogs when it comes to oral health. And then in feces, another area that we look at, where we look at the fecal microbiome. And clearly, you could argue you don't always need to look at the fecal microbiome to understand if a dog is healthy or unhealthy when you look at their poo. Sometimes it's obvious. But actually, some of the changes that we see in the microbiome profile in feces do help us identify what the cause of a problem may be. And so this work is starting and developing now, but the expectation is as we collect more data, we will become much more precise around what different microbiome profiles mean with respect to health, either immediate health or longer term health prospects of pets.
Well, what are some interesting skews that you see? Pets that live in different areas, pets under different circumstances. I mean, what does the data show you already?
The data shows us that pets that have some GI diseases have significantly higher levels of certain bacterial species that are linked to those conditions. And similarly, the data shows us that in healthy pets, you get a different profile. The other thing that our work has shown as well is that the profile of the microbiome, particularly the gut microbiome, changes in life stage. So if you look at the microbiome in very early life, in very young puppies, for example, you will see a very unique microbiome. And then within, as the puppy grows and develops to an adult, you'll see another healthy microbiome. And as it develops to an older adult, you'll see another type of profile of a healthy microbiome. And as it develops to a very senior dog, you'll see a very different type of profile of healthy microbiome. So microbiomes, there isn't just one definition of what a healthy microbiome looks like. It changes as we age, and it changes with the environment that we're in, which is why it's very exciting, very challenging to try to understand what the impact of the external environment has on the microbiome and how that translates into what that means for the health status of the pet as well. So I would say we have a reasonably good idea of healthy status and very unhealthy status in different life stages, particularly in dogs.
So, specifically, what does that mean? Do you see that it's just a matter of healthier dogs have more diversity, like they always say in people, but they never get into the details of? Or, what is it literally that you see that's interesting to you?
I think diversity is one area that we tend to associate more diverse microbiomes with healthier microbiomes. There are some specific bacterial species that we would associate with health, and specific higher frequency of bacterial species that we would associate with less healthy dogs. And so it's not really about necessarily one species or one group of species. It's kind of what does the whole picture look like, and how relevant is that picture, that profile of the microbiome, to the dog that you're looking at in terms of the dog's age, where it lives, and what is normal and healthy for that life stage. So I think that's what we're starting to understand now.
Well, have you looked at microbiome profiles, let's say from yourself or from people, and compared it to dogs or cats? And are they radically different? Are they somewhat different? Like, what's it look like between humans and other animals and domesticated animals?
I think there are some similarities and some differences. I would say, particularly GI microbiome, there are big differences, because the other thing that we know is that the microbiome is affected by nutrition and diet. We know that we can move the microbiome in a certain direction, for example, by increasing fiber content of the diet. And if you look at cats, for example, they're obligate carnivores. They have a very different microbiome to humans that are omnivores. And we know that impacts it. So some similarities, some differences. I would say similarly, we find in the oral microbiome, if you compare the oral microbiome of dogs and humans, we see probably more differences than similarities. Not that surprising, because our diets are very different. We eat much more refined carbohydrates as humans, and so that tends to promote higher levels of certain bacterial species. So I would say in general they're different. And so that said, sometimes you can make the same intervention and have a positive outcome. So in humans, you could have an intervention of adding more fiber to diet and have a positive outcome. And if you had made the same intervention in dogs, again, you would have a positive outcome. So as I say, some similarities, some differences.
So what will be the future of pet health and interaction with people and pets, do you think? People have to change their behavior, possibly to take better care of their pets, or is the current way in which they take care of their pets acceptable? What are some lessons you're getting early on from this work?
I think the lessons that we're getting early on and the things that we're learning as we go is that there is potential with pets, good potential in pets, in the same way there is in humans, to be much more proactive about our health and our health status. So identifying areas where we are at risk and making interventions to reduce that risk status early. And one of the examples that we have that is a product called Renal Tech, which identifies cats at high risk of chronic kidney disease 2 years earlier than any other it would be traditionally diagnosed. And so that gives the cat owner the opportunity to intervene early and change the outcome potentially and improve the health span and quality of life of the cat.
Have you looked at any other non-pet animals just to see if they have a microbiome? Or I don't know, I wonder, I look at a fly and I assume that they probably have a microbiome, and I wonder how far down it goes in simplicity. Do earthworms have one, for instance? Maybe you're not even looking. I'm sure you're really busy with pets, domesticated ones, but what's your thoughts?
Well, in all honesty, we haven't looked, but other people do look. And from the reported literature, it would appear that many species, if not all, have microbiomes, either on their skin, surface scales, fur, hair, and also in their guts, digestive tracts. And they are different. I think the microbiome work, although there are a lot of people working on it, we are at early stages, if I'm entirely honest. We're at early stages of understanding how we manipulate and modulate the microbiome to improve health generally in different circumstances. So we know general things. So we know if we increase fiber content and don't have extreme skews to either to only protein diets, then we can generate healthy microbiomes. But there is much more for us to learn. They're very diverse. There are lots of people working in lots of different species on the microbiome. Our understanding is increasing. But in the spirit of transparency, we don't understand everything at the moment. We understand more about things like oral microbiome and GI microbiome, but some of the other work on skin microbiome is just starting.
Well, what does that tell you, that every animal we know of has a microbiome? I mean, does that tell you anything special, or does it you just say, okay, well, every animal has one, and off we go, or does it tell you things?
I think that the assumption that you would make is that the fact that most of the species that have been looked at so far have a microbiome would suggest that they serve some form of function. And that function may be the same or it may be different depending on the species. And also the constituents of the microbiome. And so I think we have to be, where we can, draw conclusions. For example, generally diversity in a microbiome is usually a good thing, but it's not the only thing that makes a microbiome good. And so where we can draw conclusions and general conclusions, that's a good thing, but there are going to be subtleties within species and within different microbiomes that will impact the health outcomes of those microbiomes, and we don't understand all of that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about animals, until we started giving them what we call pet food. All animals except us, they eat raw things. Essentially, none of them cook it. So it would preserve a lot of the bacteria and whatever they're eating, in that animal. And I wonder what the interaction looks like. I was just wondering, I guess probably most animals that, snakes, dogs, cats, etc. I wonder what's happening to the interaction of the microbes of the thing they're eating versus theirs. Be interesting to look at, cats and dogs before they eat and after they eat. If you could, get an opportune poop sample and see what's different, for instance.
As I say, I think one thing we're very clear about is that what you eat will influence certainly your gut microbiome and probably your mouth microbiome as well. And so we can demonstrate that if we change the diet of a dog or cat to a more refined diet, that we can get one microbiome profile, and then if we change it back to the original diet, it will revert back to the original microbiome that it started from. So I think that's clear. I think the challenge we have as scientists is translating that knowledge into so what? So what? You've changed the microbiome. What is the profile of a microbiome that drives health and well-being in a specific dog at a specific life stage and in a specific health status? And that's the work that we're starting to do. And as we know, that is available in clinical practice at the moment. Fecal microbiome transplants are increasingly being used as a clinical intervention to improve the GI health of pets that are very sick and have chronic GI distress. So where you're seeding the microbiome with healthy microbiome from healthy dogs to try to seed the microorganisms to start to build a healthier profile of a microbiome in sick dogs.
Oh, so you've observed that fecal transplants, or in the literature, fecal transplants have been used on dogs or cats, for instance?
Yeah, they've been used in dogs and generally with pretty good results. And in the literature, in humans. They're used in humans as well. And particularly work for interventions with things like Clostridia difficile and this sort of thing. And again, with some degree of success. So again, that should give us confidence that microbiomes and good and healthy microbiomes can have a positive impact on pets and pet health.
Well, very good. So what's the best way for people to find out more and to get in contact? By
contacting Mars Pet Care. We're very happy to share the information that we have, to answer questions, by contacting their vets and the veterinarians, particularly if their pets don't appear to have a healthy microbiome or seem to be suffering from GI distress. Our recommendation would be go to your vet, get an assessment, get a diagnosis, and get some recommendations around what you can do to help.
Well, very good. Okay, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.